I sent out an email this week to let you know, or yesterday to let you know what the lesson was going to be about today. And it does come from our memory verse for this month, which is from Psalm 11 and verse 7, that talks about the idea of us being able to see the face of God, because He is a God who loves righteousness, and He is one who loves righteous deeds. And as Christians, we know that that's what we're supposed to be about doing. And it's a great encouragement to know that we can see the face of God as a result of being that way. However, Psalm chapter 11 is actually talking about being that type of person in a particular type of environment. And that is one in which these foundations are crumbling. And that is talking about, as we'll see in the text this morning, talking about governments and the situation that governments have produced within a society. And so that's what we'll be looking at this morning as we examine the context of our memory verse. So if you're ready for the 3 words to see your notebooks this morning. Very good. Okay, here's your 3 words. I started to choose chaotic, violent, and chaos. I said that would not be very encouraging. So instead I chose these: temple, throne, and countenance. And the reason being is because this is the opposite of those other words. That when you think about what we're talking about with a temple, we know that that is the dwelling place of someone who is a king, someone who is in authority. Throne is a word that represents that idea of someone sitting in a position of authority, making decisions, and these decisions having a far-reaching effect upon not only the nation of that king, but even the other nations around them. Countenance has not just the idea of seeing someone or scrutinizing someone so much as it is the reaction of the face upon seeing those things. One of the first places we see this, or really the first place we see it, is when Cain and Abel. That when Cain's sacrifice was not accepted, his countenance failed. The expression on his face showed what was in his heart. And so these 3 words are important for the lesson today, because the question that comes to us that we're going to be thinking about is this: for you, where is the throne? Where is the temple? And whose countenance is it that you're most concerned with? Is it in Washington, D.C., or is it in heaven where God is at? Because in Psalm chapter 11, we're going to see that there are people who are giving David advice to run and flee like a bird or fly like a bird to the mountains, because the foundations are being destroyed. And if that happens, what are the righteous supposed to do in such a situation as that? But if you look at the verse that was read for us a few moments, I appreciate Matt reading these verses for us in 1 Timothy chapter 2, and we know this also from Romans chapter 13, that God did establish certain institutions among men. The first one that He created was in the very beginning with Adam and Eve, and that was the home. The second one that He created that we see when God Himself was to be a king over His people, and also that people were governing themselves with certain rules and regulations, that God was the one who established the idea, the principle of governments. The third one that we see was established in the New Testament when God established His kingdom, His church. These 3 great institutions are all ruled over and overseen by God. And any of those institutions that do not fulfill their God-given purpose will be destroyed, period. There's no other alternative. You reap what you sow. And so in 1 Timothy 2, and we see this in Romans chapter 13 as well, is that what is Paul saying? Paul is telling Timothy to pray and to tell other people to pray for your leaders. Pray for these people who will rule over you, because these are people that were put in place for a certain reason. The reason that they were put in place, as it says in 1 Timothy and also Romans 13, is that we, not the country, we as Christians live quiet and peaceable lives. That we have the ability, as it says, that He desires all men to be saved. If the government stands between us and that ability, that government is wrong in the sight of God and needs to be destroyed. And it will be destroyed by God eventually. Or the nation itself is going to unravel so much that God doesn't have to step in, and we're just going to destroy ourselves. And so the idea that Christians who are supposed to be crying out against the unrighteousness that happens within our families, that Christians are supposed to be crying out against the unrighteousness that happens within the church, but then Christians turn around and say that we are not supposed to say anything when it comes to unrighteousness within the government, have misunderstood God's 3 great institutions and the reason that they were created to begin with. That's basically what the lesson is all about today. And so let us go to Psalm chapter 11 and look at some of the things that are found in that text. Psalm chapter 11, or Psalm 11, I should say. First 3 verses of Psalm 11 This is David speaking. And David says, "In the Lord I put my trust." Some of your versions, which I think is actually a little bit better understanding of it, "Jehovah is my refuge," is what he says in that first verse. "How can you say to my soul, flee as a bird to the mountain? For look, the wicked bend their bow. They make ready their arrow on the string, that they may shoot secretly the upright in heart. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do?" And so at the very beginning, we see that David is asking this question of his friends or counselors, I believe them to be. And they're telling him that you need to run. And the reason being is because people have readied their bow and their arrow. And they're going to shoot secretly at you in the dark to destroy you. And so if the foundation, which I believe they're actually looking at David as being that foundation because he was the one chosen by God to represent God among the people and to bring Israel to where God intended for them to be. And if this foundation is destroyed, what can we do then? And I also believe that this is probably, we don't know for sure, but probably written during the time where Saul was in his moral decline throughout the nation, and most likely, as some commentators believe, on that occasion when he killed a lot of the priests of God. And we know that in Saul's life, he set himself up as being the priest, to tell the people what was right and to do things that the priests were supposed to do, like offering sacrifices and such things as that. Much like what we see in our own nation, that the government is the one who's trying to tell us what the difference between a man and a woman or the other, however many genders there are. That the government's the one that tells us what it is that we can and cannot preach when it comes to homosexuality or marriage. That the government is the one who tells us what we can and cannot do when it comes to raising our families and choosing what our children are going to be taught and led in. That is not the role of the government. The role of the government is to make sure that I have free will and the ability to do those things. And if they don't do that, they're violating their God-given principle. This is something that David saw in his own generation. We know Proverbs 14, verse 34 says very plainly that righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. It doesn't matter if it's our time period or whatever time period it's been. It's a reproach to any people. And we've seen that nation after nation has fallen because of them neglecting and forsaking the things that bring peace to God's people among that nation. The average life expectancy of world empires is just over 200 years. We've outlived that by a little bit, not by a lot. And look where we're at. Long ways from where we started. And it may not be that God needs to step in to do something about that, because we're doing a pretty good job ourselves with destroying that. In Psalm 118, verses 8 and 9, it says, "It is better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in man. It is better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in princes." And too many of us as Christians, as brethren, we've been putting too much of our confidence in whoever it is that resides in the palace, in the White House, or whatever political party that it is that we're holding allegiance to. Because if they are not standing by the principles of God, we have no business supporting them, period, no matter what letter it is. If they're not on God's side, we are not on their side. But what has happened in our day and time is this, is that political parties or movements or skin color or education or wealth, that has become our God. Politicians have become the elders. CNN and Fox News have become the preachers. Facebook and Twitter has become our churches. And that's where we evangelize. And we're trying to win a whole lot more people over to being on the side of a government than on the side of God. And if we do it that way, we will never get where we're supposed to be. But we must also make no mistake about it. The foundations are being destroyed. That we have those in government positions that are constantly attacking the righteous. It was in David's time, and it's in our time as well. The righteous are the one that the bows are being drawn back, that the arrow is in the notch. These people are doing these things secretly, privately. You don't know where it's coming from. Where we most often get these attacks are in the back. And the things that are actually going on are not the things that they're ultimately trying to accomplish. The things that are going on, and brethren, we have to understand this. The things that are going on in our society are not about the things going on in our society. And we get so wrapped up in them, we forget what is actually taking place is behind the scenes. And that these people are working for God, not for your cause. They don't believe in your cause. They believe in getting you on their side. Satan is wanting to destroy you with that cause. So don't let him do that. Some of the things that are so very apparent to us ought to be just in our day and time. Abortion being called an essential service. All of us have gone through this COVID-19 thing for over a year now. That's a long 2-week period to flatten a curve. But during that time, what were some of the things that happened? We saw that businesses were shut down unless you sold liquor, unless it was lottery tickets, or unless it was an abortion clinic. You can't go to work. You can't even go to church in a lot of places, but you can go get an abortion. Now you tell me, are those people actually interested in women's health care? The hospitals were open. Are they actually interested in that? Are they actually interested in protecting abortion? Or are they interested in promoting the total destruction of God's standards? I believe once we see the difference, we'll understand what our role is supposed to be in such societies as that. Think about how this abortion thing has grown and flourished. Every 24 seconds, a baby dies. Now, a baby is murdered. And murdered by someone who believes they have the right to do that and is backed by government people who says, we will protect your right to do that, who are backed by Christians who vote for them. Since 1992, when President Bill Clinton said that he wants abortion to be safe, legal, and rare, from there we've grown to the point where it's no longer something that's supposed to be rare, to something that should be protected even to the moment that the child comes forth from the mother's womb. Now you tell me, is that upholding God's righteous standards? Or is the foundations being destroyed? And you tell me, should we be speaking about such things? Because often when I speak about these types of things, or when other preachers have spoken about these things, inevitably what happens is that you have a few brethren who get mad because it was their candidate that voted for it. Well, God didn't vote for it, and I'm not going to vote for it, and neither should you. Then others come out and they say, well, it was really brave to say something like that. Really, in front of God's people, it's brave to talk about abortion being wrong and not backing it? Brethren, foundations are being destroyed. These are some of the fundamental qualities that we ought to be able to understand. Think about this one. Did you ever think someone was ever going to ask you, what is your preferred pronoun? What? It took a little while before I even understood what they were talking about with that. But now I've started receiving forms that I have to fill out. What is your preferred pronoun? My preferred pronoun is this. I think that's a stupid question. That's my preferred pronoun. The thing about it is that when you think about things such as gender equality, right? There's a bill that has already passed the House that's going to the Senate that's been held in reserve for whenever the Republicans got out of office because President Trump said that he was going to veto it. President Biden and Vice President Harris are eager to sign it, and it's one that is called the Equality Act, H.R. 5. And what this act does is it extends the Civil Rights Act of the 60s to also include not just those of certain races and things such as that, but also those who are transgendered. Now, they should not be discriminated against is the way that it's marketed. The reality is this, is that what it does is it allows your daughter to be in the same locker room with a guy who says that he's a woman. That your daughter being in a bathroom and some guy walks in with her because he identifies as a female. It also does this, it dismantles churches' ability and religious organizations, and I'm using those in quotes because I'm talking about in general terms. It denies them the ability to not hire someone just because it goes against your religious beliefs. Because what has been happening when it comes to this idea of freedom of religion, it's no longer called freedom of religion most of the time. It's called freedom to worship. And there's a big difference between those two. Freedom to worship, as it's being used as a term in our day and time, means that we're not going to deny you the right to go to church. Well, we see that that's not true because of the pandemic. Freedom of religion is what the founding fathers gave you, which means you have the right, as God intended, to preach and to teach and practice your God-given devotion whenever and wherever you want. You can pray in school, you can read your Bible in school. As a matter of fact, it was once a textbook in schools. Millions upon millions of dollars were spent in the very first beginning of the country because they said that a country that is not founded upon biblical principles is not worthy to stand. But as we were told many, many years ago, that we're just a few days away from fundamentally changing the United States of America by changing our culture, our traditions, the things that we talk about and how we talk about them. I don't remember talking about preferred pronouns up until the last few years. And there's a lot of things like that. It's also interesting that some of the ones who are the biggest proponent, or the biggest opponents, I should say, of this idea of the Equality Act are actually the feminists. The feminists from the 90s that were all about the women's movement and giving women rights and trying to overthrow things in churches by making women preachers and giving roles such as that and how you can't deny those types of things. That they're actually opposed to this. And the reason being is because they were the ones who wanted women's sports for themselves. But opening up with this other thing is now allowing men to compete with women and taking scholarships. One woman that was beaten in a mixed martial arts fight the other day had all the bones of her skull broken because she was fighting with a man who identified as a female. And it did not end well. There's a case that happened not too long ago. This woman wakes up because someone has broken into her house and she's raped. And then that rapist, who has done this multiple times, confesses to it, is convicted of it, and he's sent to a woman's prison because he identifies as a woman, even though he is a rapist. And he is now in a women's prison because he says that he feels like a woman. If we are not upside down and backward, if God does not look down upon this and say that your time is running out, I don't know how much further it will go. But this is really the question. Do we see it? Brethren, do we see what's going on? Do we know what's happening when these things take place? I want us to look in Ezekiel chapter 8 and 9 for a few moments. Ezekiel chapter 8 and 9. If you remember what Ezekiel is about, Ezekiel's prophesying just before the nation is going into Babylonian captivity. And Ezekiel is prophesying against the people, and it's gotten so bad in both Israel and Judah that God himself, who's always been the one who is dwelling in the temple, is about to remove his glory from the temple, and it never returns again. That God is, okay, I'm done. I'm done with you. So Ezekiel is told, as he's the prophet, some of the responsibilities he has to have. And we're going to go through these chapters fairly quickly, but if you look at verse 3, I think this is kind of funny. Ezekiel is taken by the lock of his hair. So this angel of God, Spirit of God, takes Ezekiel by his hair and picks him up off the earth and takes him and carries him by the hair of his head. You ever been so mad at one of your children that that's what you wanted to do? You take them by their collar, maybe by their ear, and you bring them and say, do you see what you did? Now, this is what has happened. So he's taken in verse 6. Furthermore, he said to me, sort of man, do you see what they are doing? And this is at the courtyard. The great abominations that the house of Israel commits here, to make me go far away from my sanctuary. Now turn again, you will see greater abominations. So he takes him to, in verse 7, the door of the court. And in verse 8, when he goes there, he tells him to dig into the wall, and he finds this door. And in verse 9, he says, go in and see the wicked abominations which they are doing there. In verse 11, these are 70 men of the elders of the house of Israel. So we have the religious people, the shepherds, the elders of the house of Israel. Look what they are doing in verse 12. Have you seen what the elders of the house of Israel do and how they're doing these things in the dark? Every man in the room of his idols. And this is why the Lord doesn't see us. Well, the Lord doesn't care about this. The Lord's not interested in this. The Lord has forsaken the land. Verse 13, it says, turn again, and you will see greater abominations that they are doing. At the end of verse 14, women are sitting and weeping for this female, this fertility god. And so it's not just the men, but their wives and women as well. Verse 15, have you seen this, O son of man? Turn again, you'll see greater abominations. He takes them to the inner court in verse 16 of the temple, and he sees 25 men there, and these men are facing to the east, and they're worshiping the sun to the east. And he said to me, have you seen this, O son of man? Is it a trivial thing to the house of Israel to commit the abominations which they commit here? For they have filled the land. Not just that they are doing these things when it comes to their worship, but they have filled the land with violence, and they have returned to provoke me to anger. I've been preaching for what, about 15 minutes now? Calculate that by every 24 seconds another baby is killed in this country. Every 24 seconds, how many babies have been murdered in just this short amount of time? Have we not filled the land with violence? We have filled the land with violence. We have filled the land. Not talking about them, not talking about the government officials. I'm talking about us. We have filled the land because we see these things. And do we do anything about it? That's the point that he's making here. And he's going to make a distinction because notice as he continues, they have returned to provoke me to anger. Therefore I also will act in my fury. My eye will not spare, nor will I have pity. And though they cry in my ears with a loud voice, I will not hear them. Husbands, how terrified are we when we hear that if we don't treat our wives with understanding, in an understanding way, that God will not hear our prayers are hindered. Knowing, brethren, that we do not speak out against these types of things, stand opposed to them, and even in some cases, God forbid, someone decides to support them, your prayers are not being heard when you cry out for deliverance. Because as he continues in chapter 9, people are called for to go throughout the land with sword. And on one of their side is this one who has an inkwell. And he's told to take this inkwell in verse 4, go through the midst of the city, through the midst of Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of men who sigh and cry over all the abominations that are done within it. Now, he goes through the land and he starts putting the marks symbolically, obviously, in this vision, of the ones who sigh and cry about this thing. The ones who don't receive this mark, the people of God, most of them. The elders among the people, most of them. And the ones that in their own homes have turned their back on God and his ways. Because they no longer sigh, they no longer cry about these things. We too often ask the wrong question. Back during the 90s, and we all remember, I can't say all, a lot of us remember that during the 90s when it came to the idea of was the president committing an affair in the Oval Office? And if you remember at the beginning of that, it was a question of, some people said, yes, he did. Others said, no, he didn't. Yes, he did. No, he didn't. And that was the thing. Well, then it came out, well, yes, he did. And then they said, well, okay, I was wrong. Yes, he did, but it doesn't matter. We should have been asking that question from the beginning. Instead of arguing about whether or not he did it or not, we should have been saying, does it matter if he did? Does it matter to you if he did? Brother, you need to decide now, what is your breaking point? What is the point when you're going to say, I am no longer going to go along with these types of things? I'm not going to put up with it. I don't care if your parents voted that way throughout your family history or not. I don't care what kind of tax breaks they give us. I don't care what it is when it comes to some of the programs that they have in our society that we can have differences of opinion about. But brother, we can't have a difference of opinion when it comes to murder. There is no difference of opinion on that. There is no difference of opinion between the idea there are two genders. There's no difference of opinion when it comes that our nation's capital shouldn't have the LGBTQIA plus squared by whatever rainbow on the White House. It should not be happening. And brethren, we should not be in favor of it. If the foundations are being destroyed, what can the righteous do? David says, how can you say to my soul, flee? How can you say, fly to the mountains? Yes, I know their arrow is pointed toward me. I know I'm in their crosshairs. But for me to flee right now, David is basically saying, is repugnant. We had one of the political leaders in the House say not too long ago, House of Representatives say not too long ago, when asked about some of the violence that was going on, well, people do what people do. Sadly, I've heard brethren repeat that. People do what people do. So what am so just don't say anything about it anymore? Brethren, are we supposed to preach about marriages becoming stronger, better? Preach against things like adultery in marriage? What about adultery in the church? How about that other institution, adultery in the government? If one of my sisters in Christ wanted to have an abortion, would you want me to say people do what people do? Would you want me and Charlie as the elders? People do what people do. Or would you want us to say something about it? We have to preach the truth. Light must shine in darkness. It's the reason you were saved. The government is supposed to get out of the way so that you can live a quiet, peaceful life and preach the gospel without restraint. If you can't talk about abortion, gender, in the place that you work, the places that you shop, the circles that you are in, and with your neighbors because of the government, this government needs to be moved aside. And there's a lot of people who are willing to do that because now they're wanting to burn it all down. And not to replace it with something that's godly, but as they themselves have advocated, they want anarchy. And so a lot of the movements that are going on today have been infiltrated by these people. There are good, godly, honest people who want to make sure that we do have racial equality in this country. And those people are being used as, this is going to hurt, useful idiots, because they're being used to push a political agenda and not a moral stance. That's why we as Christians are supposed to be so much wiser, so much smarter than that. If it does not move us toward God, it is not moving us in the right direction. And we as God's people have to move beyond whatever it is. I cannot be worshiping, and brethren, you cannot be worshiping your skin color. You cannot be worshiping your bank account. You cannot be worshiping at the altar of whatever your political party or position is. You cannot. God is on the throne. God is in his holy temple. And as Habakkuk said, let all the earth keep silence before him. So when we start hearing all these voices and all these things going on, be quiet. My God is on his throne. My God is in his temple. And I'm going to listen to what he has to say. And that's going to put us at odds with a lot of people, even brethren. Because let's just be honest about a few things. Let's be very plain spoken about a few things. It's not brave right now for preachers to be talking about racism. That is not a brave thing to talk about. That's the thing that everybody expects, that you get people on your side. But when you tell people, no, what you need to do is stop worshiping your skin color, that's not popular. But that's the truth, because that's just a tent. You're going to put it off. God doesn't care whether you're Jew, Gentile, black, white, purple, whatever else it is. You are a soul created in the image of God, and I want you to go to heaven because I am more interested in your soul than the tent that you're dwelling in. And that's the way all Christians are supposed to be. Whether you're part of the oppressed or whether you're part of the oppressor's race, doesn't matter. I'm a Christian. My God is on the throne, and he is in heaven above. The foundations are being destroyed. Don't be a useful idiot for those who are trying to destroy it. David says, how can you say to my soul to flee? I can't do that. There are times where we're supposed to run. Not in these times. You flee temptation. You flee from sin. But when a nation's foundations are crumbling, you are not supposed to flee. You're not supposed to just let all things happen naturally. You're not supposed to throw your hands up and say, well, what can we do? There's nothing we can do. Yes, there is. And that's what David reminds his people of. And so in the next few verses of Psalm 11, before we leave Ezekiel 9 and verse 9, then he said to me, the iniquity of the house of Israel and Judah is exceedingly great, and the land is full of bloodshed, and the city full of perversity. For they say the Lord has forsaken the land, and the Lord does not see. In other words, God doesn't care. He is not interested in these things. So basically the same thing that David's companions were saying, what can the righteous do? So here's David's response in verses 4 through 6. He says that the Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes behold, his eyelids test. Some of your versions may have the word examine. You may have a cross note there that means scrutinizes the sons of men. The Lord tests the righteous, but the wicked and the one who loves violence, his soul hates. Upon the wicked he will rain coals, fire, and brimstone, and a burning wind shall be the portion of their cup. There is something that is waiting for those who love violence, those who speak well of the violence, those who support the violence. There's a cup that's waiting to be poured out, and you have a portion in that that's just waiting for you. But for the rest of us, we need to understand this, that God is indeed on his throne. And as we said a few moments ago, his throne and his holy temple tells us that not only is God the one who is in this place that is separated from all of mankind. There is no temple during the time of David. There's no temple. So when David is talking about the temple, he is talking about heavenly temple. And when he's talking about the throne, he's talking about that heavenly throne, not the throne of the king of the land, but the throne of God. And when he sees this throne, it is so high above everyone that we're reminded of Proverbs 15 and verse 3 that the eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good, that God sees all of it. There's nothing that escapes his attention. He knows what is happening. And not only that, but brethren, we know this. God not only knows what's happening, but he also understands the motives behind it. He knows what I do. There's nothing secret. God took Ezekiel by the hair of his head and he said, come look what people are doing. Take a look at it. See what's happening. You see that wall that's there? Dig a hole under that wall and look in that door. See what people are doing secretly in their own homes. Look what the women are crying about and worried about. Look what the people are doing that have turned their back on the temple of God because they don't think God sees it. I see it. Ezekiel, do you see it? Because you're the prophet and you're supposed to speak out against it. The Lord sees all of it. His eyelids, that idea is that he squints with his eyes to examine, to look very closely. And this is what he's doing when he sees that. When you go to places like Psalm 26, verses 1 through 5, David says, vindicate me, O Lord, for I have walked in my integrity. I have also trusted in the Lord. I shall not slip. Examine me, O Lord, and prove me. Try my mind and my heart, for your loving kindness is before my eyes, and I have walked in your truth. I have not sat with the idolatrous mortals. Can I say that? Brethren, can we say that? When it comes to the moral decline and decay of this nation, can we say that we have not sat with the idolatrous mortals? Can I, with David, say, nor will I go in with the hypocrites who tell me that they're interested in racial equality while they stoke the flames of racial division? Do I sit with the hypocrites? I think every one of us, if we're honest, would say that, you know when a politician's lying because what's he doing? His mouth's moving. Why is that a common cliche? Because every one of us believe it. But then do we not also say, but they're the ones who's going to deliver us from it? We have to trust them. We as a nation have something that a lot of nations don't have. We have a right to vote. That means we are stewards of who's appointed leaders of the land. And what's God going to do when it comes to being a steward? Is he not going to judge us by our stewardship? How did you use it? Same with your money. Same with your children. The same with the decisions we make in this area as well. I will not go in with the hypocrites. I will not sit with idolatrous mortals. And I'm not going to vote for a person just because it has a certain letter behind their name. If they're a person who does things that are opposed to God, his will, his judgment, his rule, that makes it hard for me to stand up in front of God's people and speak the truth, and then causes my brethren to say, well, that was a brave message when it comes straight from God's word, I will not vote for that person. Because to do so would not be a good steward. And I know that makes people mad. Brethren, I know it. And it hurts my heart to say that it makes people mad. But you know why you keep hearing it? Because we don't learn. We don't learn. And we need to stop trusting in palaces and thrones of men and understand God is on his throne and God is in his holy temple. Why should you say to me to flee? Why should you tell me to keep quiet? Why should you tell me that I shouldn't say this in front of God's people? Why should you tell me that I should not decide who I vote for based on whether or not they're going to uphold God's standards? How can you say such a thing to me? God is on the throne, and that's who I serve. Who do you serve? Are you interested in the flesh? Are you only interested in the flesh? That's what David's companions were. They're going to kill you, David. David says to flee to the mountains would be a failure of my faith. We talked about it a little bit in class this morning. Your faith doesn't mean anything if it hasn't been tested in an area of danger. That's what real faith is. That's how God tests us, because that's what it says about the righteous. The times we're living in, brethren, are doing this to us. It is testing us, and God is looking, and God is scrutinizing, and God not only sees your actions, but he sees your heart. Is it hard to go against the way that we were raised? Absolutely it is. So many of us have had to deal with that in a lot of different areas. And no doubt when it comes to this is one of those areas as well. And again, I don't care which letter you've got in your mind right now. I hope everybody's mad about it. Because you can't trust in that letter. Can't trust it. Because what have they done? One side says we need to make this a whole lot more available. The other side says we need to stop them right here. And both of those are the wrong answer. You don't stop them right here. You get rid of it. You stop it completely. You remove it from society. Or else, my God who is on the throne is going to send a strong, mighty, fiery, dry wind. And when you think about how it's been in the Midwest when these great sweeping winds come through, that it is so strong, it is so hot, it is so arid, it is so fiery, that it wipes away everything off the top of the ground and leaves the land barren and dry. Like Sodom and Gomorrah, fire and brimstone will rain down upon these nations, these people. David knows that because God sees it. David says, I don't want to be a part of it, so I'm not going to sit with the hypocrites. I'm not going to be someone who's going to sit with the idolatrous mortals. I will not sit with the wicked. I'm going to be more like Psalm 1. And I'm not going to walk in their counsel. I'm not going to listen to their advice. I'm not going to listen to the advice, quite honestly, brethren, I'm not going to listen to the advice of brethren who say that we need to keep quiet and stop talking about these things. I stop talking about these things when our nation stops doing them. Because God says I'm supposed to preach the truth. And if I want to save my soul and yours as well, this is what we're supposed to do. Be godly. And remember, God is going to punish. And it may not be he, through his providence or through his direct action, that destroys this nation. Because, brethren, we're doing a pretty good job of it ourselves. Are we not? It is falling apart all around us. And the reason being is because we left some of the founding principles of this country. We have rewrote history saying that it was never a good nation. It was a nation that was not founded upon godly principles. It was a nation that wasn't even founded upon the years that our history has always told us it was. Because you can't rewrite history. You can repackage it. But brethren, when we look at our history, we have to accept the good, the bad, and the ugly. All of it. And own it. And do better. That's what we're supposed to do with our history. And so David concludes, and this is where our memory verse comes from, is Psalm 11 and verse 7. For the Lord is righteous. He loves righteousness. The New King James says, his countenance beholds the upright. The ESV and some other versions turn that around, that the righteous are going to behold his face and see him. And what the verse is saying is that one day we're going to see God face to face if we are righteous, because God loves righteousness and he loves righteous deeds. That means God loves people who are like him. And those are the ones that are going to seek his face and see his face. Because as it says in Proverbs 8 and verse 17, I love those who love me, God says. And those who seek me diligently will find me. And that's not confined just to our nation and our country. This is something that's for every nation and every country. The Christian who's over in China that does not have the ability and is put to death when he speaks against his government, he has a responsibility to seek God face to face. And he has a responsibility to speak the truth. And he has a responsibility of speaking out against those things that his government is doing. And he is punished a lot worse than what we are. You get banned off Twitter. Oh, I don't know how I'm going to make it through the next week. Or maybe you lose your job. Maybe you lose your job. Maybe brethren don't want to sit by you anymore. God loves the righteous. I love those who love me. God's on his throne. He is in his holy temple. And brethren, he sees you. He knows what you're going through. But also know this, you're being tested. And count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. You're like silver that has dross that needs to be removed. God says, I know it's rough, but you have to go through the fire because I need those things out of you. You never know how valuable trust is until everything else that you have trusted in has been taken away from you. And that's what's happening. I never thought some of the things that are happening now I would ever see in my lifetime. I also tell you this, I never thought it could get any worse than it did 30 years ago. Boy, was I wrong. Sodom and Gomorrah, God tells Abraham that he's going to destroy the city. Abraham goes through that discourse. What if there's 50 righteous people? Well, I won't destroy it for that. Then you know it comes down and down and down, and finally comes to 10. And God says, even for the sake of 10, I will not destroy the city. You had Lot, his wife, and his 2 daughters that came out of the city. They were 6 people short of being able to save the city. When will it be that we are too few people to save this nation? That's really the point. Brother, the only way that we do that is by evangelizing. It's by teaching our neighbors, our friends, our family about God's righteous standards. And when they understand the righteous standards, they won't do the unrighteous things that many of us have done. Because if we forget the basic principles that we're talking about here, we draw wrong conclusions and we pursue futile efforts. When God has given us a very simple formula. You go back to the Psalms of Ascent, and one of them you see that it begins with a man sitting around the table with his family. And they talk to their neighbors. And as they begin to change their family and their neighbors, then they begin to change cities and regions and countries and the world. 12 men shook the foundations of the earth by the preaching and teaching of the gospel. I love those who love me, God says. Those who seek me diligently are going to find me. Those who forsake the law praise the wicked. But those who keep the law strive against them. If I'm praising the ones who are advocates of abortion, I'm one who has forsaken the law. If I'm praising the one who says, well, we just need to slow it down, I've forsaken the law. Does that hit both parties pretty good? I hope so. Half measures, brethren, aren't going to get it. It's not going to get it. Those who say, yes, well, we don't want to discriminate against an 8-year-old decides that, it'll be a lot easier for me to be transgender, which our current president said. And if we speak well of it, we've forsaken the law. Our job is to strive against them, not to sit back, not to be silent, but to strive against them. And I hope we understand, I'm not talking about through the violence that we've seen. I'm not talking about storming the Capitol I'm not talking about burning down businesses. I'm not talking about hashtagging things. I'm not talking about putting something on your Facebook picture to show how supportive you are. I'm talking about actually doing something for God in the midst of it and doing it in a godly way. Let's go to Amos chapter 7, because it does not take someone who is great, someone who is awesome, someone in a great position of authority to accomplish these things. Amos chapter 7 and starting at verse 12. Then Amaziah said to Amos, and Amaziah is one of the priests during this time, and he's saying to Amos, "Go, you seer, flee to the land of Judah. There eat bread, and there prophesy, but never again prophesy at Bethel. For it is the king's sanctuary, and it is his royal residence." Don't be bringing your godliness and righteousness to the king. Do that in your own hometown. Who's supposed to be holding righteousness? The king. Where's the right place to be saying righteousness needs to be pouring forth from here? The palace of the king. To tell us, you go do that, you have freedom to worship. I have freedom of religion that was given to me by my God that you can't take away. And it's better to obey God than man. So he tells him, "Go, you seer, do this at home, but don't do it by the king's residence." Amos answered and said to Amaziah, I was no prophet, nor was I son of a prophet. I was a sheep breeder, a tender of sycamore trees. Then the Lord took me as I followed the flock, and the Lord said to me, "Go prophesy to my people Israel. Now therefore hear the word of the Lord. You say, do not prophesy against Israel, and do not spout against the house of Isaac." That's what you say. Verse 17, but this is what God says. "Your wife shall be a harlot in the city. Your sons and daughters shall fall by the sword. Your land shall be divided by a survey line. You shall die in a defiled land, and Israel shall surely be led away captive from his own land." So, brethren, what are we supposed to be saying? It'll be okay. You know, the next president will change it. The next Congress will change it. What do we say to all of them? You keep up this path. You don't stop murdering these babies. You keep telling people that there's more than just the two genders. You remove children from their homes for being taught that and charge their parents with being abusive. You take preachers off the streets by speaking the truth because there are people who are spreading hate crimes. You keep doing it, and this nation's going to be destroyed by God, not by these other people and not by the political parties. God is going to have his day of reckoning, because God's book is not a book of empty threats, brethren. God is not playing around. This nation, this world survived a long time without this nation. It will do just fine without it, because God sees his people. And his people will be okay. And I want to be okay. And I want my children to be okay and grandchildren to be okay. And I am like Paul. My heart's desire for this nation is that it be saved. But if it keeps supporting those things, I have no part of it, because I'm part of a different kingdom. Are we not? Are we not? And this foundation will never be destroyed. Never be destroyed. So one last passage before we close. You've been very patient this morning. Psalm 18. This is why David said, "How can you say to me to flee?" He had stood against a giant. He had been pursued by a king. His own son even sought to kill him on occasions. But David knew that he had to stand strong, and this is why. Psalm 18, starting at verse 1. Really, this whole psalm is worthy of your reading. "I will love you, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God and my strength in whom I trust, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold." As we sang a few moments ago, "I will call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised. So shall I be saved from my enemies. The pangs of death surrounded me, and the floods of ungodliness made me afraid. The sorrows of Sheol surrounded me. The snares of death confronted me. In my distress I called upon the Lord and cried out to my God. He heard my voice from his temple, and my cry came before even to his ears." This is how God responds. "The earth shook and trembled. The foundations of the hills also quaked and were shaken. And this is why. Because he was angry. It is worthy of our reading. It is worthy of our meditation. It's worthy of our efforts. And brethren, it is worthy for us when we see what is happening around us, when we see the foundations crumbling, when we see those who are targeting the righteous, and even when these things come from even among some of God's own people, when those things happen, it is understandable to cry out, what can the righteous do? Understand this, it's not about what you can do, it's about what will you do. And more importantly, it's about this, what is God going to do? Because when I cry out to my God, brother, when you cry out to your God, when you put your trust in him and you say your prayers to God and whom you love, where you put your trust and you cry out to God, God, I know you see what they are doing to us. I know that you see it. And I know the punishment that's coming. And I am trying my best to fight against those types of things. But I'm one person. We're a few people. We're trying our best against these things. Understand that God will shake the very foundation of the earth because God is angry. And he is going to respond. And brethren, we will see his face. That's what I want more than anything else. That's what I want more than anything else. I would love it if the nation would turn around and do godly things. That's great. That's wonderful. But more than anything else, I just want to see the face of God. Because then it means we're just done. We're finished with all of it. And we can finally see him face to face. That's what the desire is. And that's what we should be looking forward to. So the question is, are you going to stand or are you going to run? In this area, there's not a chance to run. We're not supposed to run from this one. The foundations are being destroyed. Our job is to evangelize the lost. Our job is to save as many souls that we can. I can't run from that. And if the things that they're doing are interfering with that, God needs to remove them. God, get this nation out of the way if they're going to keep us from preaching the truth. Get it out of the way. Give me a chance to speak to others about your glory, about your majesty, and how you trust in him and him alone. Brethren, will we stand or will we run? That's your options. Whatever you do, do it to the glory of God. And do it by his authority. And do it by the power that he gives us as his people. If you're subject to the invitation, please come as we stand and sing.